Twilight in Eden. A man and a woman stand paralyzed behind the dense wood of the garden, holding their breath as the wind shifts. They are not hiding from an abstract feeling of guilt, and they are not bracing for a telepathic judgment. They are listening to the rhythm of physical footsteps pressing into the soil. Picture it. The shadows are stretching long. The heat of the afternoon is breaking, and something heavy is moving through the trees. But the English translation we have read our entire lives masks an impossible sensory paradox in this exact moment. We are taught that God himself was taking a quiet evening stroll. The canonical text records something far stranger. Genesis 3, 8 inches. The King James reads, "And they heard the voice of the Lord God walking in the garden in the cool of the day. And Adam and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord God amongst the trees of the garden." Stop right there. Look closely at the exact grammar of that verse. The text does not say they heard the Lord God walking. It explicitly says, they heard the voice of the Lord God walking. The subject of the verb is the voice. An auditory frequency is taking deliberate, physical strides across the dirt. Read that again. The central mystery of this twilight confrontation is not why the humans hid, but how a spoken sound could possess the physical mass required to break branches and crush leaves. In the original Hebrew, that word for voice is kol. It usually translates as a sound, a noise, or the bleating of a flock. But here, at the epicenter of the fall, this QAL has legs. It occupies three-dimensional space. It is a sound with a shadow. See the scene. Adam and Eve are terrified because the invisible breath that spoke the cosmos into existence has suddenly localized. It is no longer everywhere at once. It is approaching them from a specific direction. And this bizarre, walking sound was so troubling, so dangerously physical, that the earliest Jewish preservers of the text could not leave it alone. 2,000 years ago, when the Torah was read aloud in the ancient synagogues, the readers did not speak it in Hebrew. They paraphrased it into Aramaic for the common people, reading from ancient scrolls known as the Targums. Targum Onkelos, one of the oldest and most revered of these Aramaic translations, refused to translate Genesis 3 to 8 verbatim. The ancient scholars knew a mere invisible voice could not walk through a garden. They knew the Hebrew text was hiding a physical manifestation, so they changed the word. They substituted the Hebrew kol with the Aramaic Memra, the word. They read it not as a sound, but as the physical word of the Lord walking in the garden. I offer it as that. One tradition's record of how the ancients wrestled with the impossible physics of Eden. The Memra was never just a metaphor to the readers of the Targum. It was the visible, interactive entity of God, the word that took form, the word that had feet, the word that called out into the dusk, asking a man exactly where he was hiding. But to understand how a voice could shatter the quiet of the trees, we have to look deeper into the raw anatomy of that original Hebrew word. The garden is suddenly occupied by a sound that carries the sheer, crushing weight of a body. But this is not the only time. The biblical text gives this exact Hebrew word a terrifying physical mass. What exactly happens when the kol of the Lord strikes the earth? High in the mountains of Lebanon, the ancient cedars are shattering. Trunks massive enough to build temples are snapping like kindling. The earth beneath them is convulsing. But if you ask the Hebrew poets what is causing this violence, they will not point to a storm front. They will point to a sound. Picture it. Psalm 29. 5 inches, the King James reads, "The voice of the Lord breaketh the cedars. Yea, the Lord breaketh the cedars of Lebanon." Verse 8 continues, "The voice of the Lord shaketh the wilderness. The Lord shaketh the wilderness of Kadesh." Stop right there. Look at the noun driving that destruction. The voice. The English translation obscures the connection, but the original text is using the exact same Hebrew word we just left behind in the Garden of Eden: call. I offer this as one reading of the ancient poetry, a way to see the sheer mass of the word they used. We in the modern West think of a voice as a fragile, invisible thing, a vibration of air, a passing wave that dissipates as soon as it leaves the vocal cords. The ancient Hebrew mind did not view the call of Yahweh as mere audio. They understood it as a localized physical force. Read that again. A force that breaks wood, a force that shakes stone, a force with enough mass to leave a footprint. When Adam and Eve hear the cool walking in Genesis 3, they are not hearing a man humming a tune on an evening stroll. They are hearing the approach of the same staggering density that splinters the cedars of Lebanon. The sound has mass. The sound has gravity. The walking voice is not an echo bouncing off the trees. It is the entity moving through them. Same word, same weight, but why does a sound need to walk? If the Creator is omnipresent, if His Spirit fills the heavens and the earth, why is the text suddenly forcing Him into a physical limitation? Why steps? Stay with me. When the ancient Jewish scribes preserved these texts, they understood the terror of the localized divine. An omnipresent God is a safe theological concept. A localized God is an immediate physical crisis. The Kol narrows the infinite down to a single, approaching point in space. The voice is taking on boundaries so that it can interact directly with a broken creation. And the text of Genesis gives us the precise environmental condition required for this narrowing to occur. It did not happen at dawn. It did not happen under the glaring heat of noon. It happened during a very specific atmospheric shift. Go back to the canonical anchor. Genesis 3-8 says the voice was walking in the garden in the cool of the day. Look at that phrase in English. It sounds like a simple drop in temperature, a pleasant evening breeze bringing relief to the garden. But strip away the translation, and the Hebrew text reveals something entirely different. The walker does not arrive because the sun is going down. The walker arrives because the atmosphere itself is altering to make room for him. The English hides the weather behind a gentle phrase, but the original language records a sudden, rushing change in the air. The sound of the footsteps is only half the terror. What exactly is the wind of the walker? The canopy of the garden begins to thrash, the silver undersides of the leaves turning violently upward as a sudden gale sweeps through the trees. This is not a gentle twilight breeze bringing relief from the sun. This is the environment itself buckling under the pressure of a localized arrival. Look at the phrasing in Genesis 3-8 again. The English text tells us the voice of the Lord God was walking in the cool of the day. We read that as a timestamp. A drop in temperature, dusk settling over Eden, but tear away the English translation and look at the raw Hebrew beneath it. The word translated as cool is ruach. Stop right there. Ruach does not mean a mild drop in degrees. Ruach is one of the most violent, powerful, and mysterious words in the biblical text. It translates as wind, it translates as breath, it translates as spirit. Adam and Eve did not hear the voice walking simply because it was a pleasant evening. They heard the voice walking in the ruach of the day, in the wind, in the spirit. The atmosphere was not just cooling down, it was physically tearing apart to make room for the walker. Read that again. The voice is using the wind as its vehicle. Go back to the very second verse of the Bible. Genesis 1:2 inches, the King James reads, "And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters." The word for spirit there is ruach. The exact same hovering, creative, terrifying force that brooded over the dark oceans of the unformed earth is now localized, ripping through the fruit trees of Eden. Same wind, same weight. When the ancient Hebrew poets visualized God moving, they did not picture a quiet stroll. They pictured a terrifying atmospheric disturbance. Look at Psalm 104-3. The psalmist describes the Lord as the one who maketh the clouds his chariot, who walketh upon the wings of the wind. Turn that final word back into Hebrew, and you find it again. Ruach. Picture it. The humans are not hiding from a soft-spoken pedestrian. They are bracing against a sudden, staggering storm front that is narrowed down to a single set of approaching footsteps. The call, the voice is moving, and the ruach, the wind, is the chariot announcing its arrival. This is one reading, not the final word, but it forces us to look at the garden not as a peaceful park, but as the epicenter of a divine collision. The Creator is entering the physical dimensions of the created. The infinite is compressing into a finite point in the dirt. Sit with that. But even with the terrifying weight of the coal and the violent arrival of the ruach, a crucial paradox remains. A sound, even a heavy one, and a wind, even a destructive one, do not leave footprints. You cannot hide behind a tree from the wind. It wraps around the trunk. Adam and Eve are hiding because the walker has a precise physical geometry. The text of Genesis demands a physical body, and the ancient Jewish scholars who preserved this text 2,000 years ago refused to ignore that demand. They knew exactly what or who was stepping through the crushing wind. Two images, one localized storm, one approaching sound. But the ancient synagogues possessed a completely different name for the walker in the trees. When the scribes translated this verse for the common people, they substituted the Hebrew voice with a physical Aramaic reality. Who exactly stepped out of the wind? A stone synagogue in the Galilee, 1st century. The scroll of Genesis is unrolled across the wooden reading desk. The reader traces the heavy, squared Hebrew letters of chapter 3. But when he opens his mouth, he does not speak the exact words written on the parchment. Picture it. The common people sitting on the stone benches no longer speak biblical Hebrew. They speak Aramaic. So as the reader scans the sacred text, he translates it aloud into the language of the street. These spoken translations, passed down and eventually written out, became the Targums. We briefly touched on them before, but now we must look directly at what they did to the garden. When the ancient reader reaches Genesis 3-8, he faces a terrifying theological crisis. The Hebrew text says the call of Yahweh, the crushing physical voice of the Lord, is walking through the trees. But Jewish theology held that God was infinite, spirit, and entirely uncontained by physical space. An omnipresent deity does not take evening strolls. An invisible spirit does not snap twigs beneath its feet. So the readers of the synagogue made a deliberate, authorized shift. There is another ancient Aramaic paraphrase, Targum Neophiti, discovered relatively recently in a Vatican library, but containing traditions that go back to the time of the Second Temple. And just like the older Targum Onkelos, Neophiti refuses to let the invisible Father walk in the dirt. Watch what the text does. Targum Neophiti translates Genesis 3-8 like this. And they heard the voice of the Memra of the Lord God walking in the garden. Stop right there. Memra. It is an Aramaic word that translates simply as the Word. But to the ancient Jewish mind, the Memra was not a grammatical placeholder. It was not a metaphor. It was the physical, interactive agent of the invisible God. Whenever the Lord needed to cross the boundary between the infinite heavens and the finite earth, he did it through the Memra. The Word was the manifestation. The Word was the localized presence. Read that again. When God creates the universe, the Targums say the Memra did it. When God saves Israel from Egypt, the Targums say the Memra redeemed them. And when a man and a woman shatter the singular command of Eden, it is the Memra, the physical, walking word of the Lord, who steps into the violent wind to find them. I offer it as that one tradition's record of how the ancients wrestled with the impossible physics of Eden. They knew the walker was God, but they also knew he was a distinct, visible manifestation of God. This completely rewrites how we read the rest of our Bible. When the Gospel of John opens in the New Testament, it famously says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." For centuries, Western scholars assumed John was borrowing the concept of the Logos from Greek philosophy. He was not. John was a Jewish fisherman. He did not grow up reading Greek philosophers. He grew up listening to the Aramaic targums in the synagogue. When John says the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, he is pointing straight back to the Memra. He is pointing straight back to the garden. The same Word that walked in the dirt of Judea in the 1st century is the exact same Word that walked in the dirt of Eden at the dawn of time. Same Word, same weight. The voice that called Adam from the trees was not a disembodied echo. It was the pre-incarnate word of the Lord. The coal had taken form. The humans were hiding because the voice had a face. But if the ancient readers understood that a divine voice could step out of the invisible realm and take on physical geometry, we have to ask if this sensory overlap ever happens again in the canonical text. Can a human actually see a sound? Two senses, one terrifying arrival. But the Hebrew Bible does not leave this atmospheric anomaly buried in the garden, because hundreds of years later, in the blinding smoke of a desert peak, an entire nation is going to witness this exact same linguistic impossibility. What happens when a voice becomes something you can look at? The desert floor of the Sinai Peninsula. 1 million people stand paralyzed at the boundary line of a smoking peak. The mountain is convulsing, the air is thick with fire, and the deafening blast of a horn. But the most terrifying thing happening at the base of Mount Sinai is not geological, it is visual. Picture it. Exodus 20, 18 inches, the King James reads, "And all the people saw the thunderings, and the lightnings, and the noise of the trumpet, and the mountain smoking. And when the people saw it, they removed and stood afar off." Stop right there. Look at the first sensory verb in that verse. The people saw the thunderings. Our modern English translations try to smooth this out, assuming it is just poetic language for experiencing a storm. We are comfortable with seeing lightning. We are comfortable with seeing smoke. But strip away the Western assumptions and look at the raw Hebrew. The word translated as thunderings is kuoloth. It is the exact plural form of cool. Read that again. Koloth. Voices. The canonical text literally says, "And all the people saw the voices." Same desert, same weight. We are right back to the terrifying paradox of the garden. In Eden, one man heard a voice walking. Centuries later, at the base of this jagged rock, an entire nation is watching voices flash across the sky. You do not see a sound, you hear it. But at Sinai, the sensory boundaries shatter. The spoken word of Yahweh is not an invisible audio wave. It occupies visual, physical space. It has a visible signature, and the ancient Jewish scholars who preserved the Torah understood this perfectly. When the Aramaic Targums paraphrase the events of Sinai, they do not apologize for the impossible physics of the text. Targum, Pseudo-Jonathan, another of these ancient synagogue translations, says the voice of the Lord went forth and became a visible entity. Ancient Jewish Midrash goes even further, describing the coal leaving the mouth of God, dividing into 70 flames of fire, and becoming a physical substance the people could track with their eyes before it engraved itself directly onto the stone tablets. I offer it as that, one tradition's record of how the ancients understood the sheer mass of the divine word. They believed the voice could be looked at. When God speaks from the mountain, the infinite is once again crossing into the finite. The voice is taking on geometry. The call is localizing so intensely that human eyes can follow its movement through the smoke. The Israelites at Sinai are terrified for the exact same reason Adam was terrified in the trees. The invisible has taken form. See the scene. 1 million people back away from the mountain because the word is physically pushing into their dimension. They are experiencing the crushing weight of the Memra. But while Sinai was a mass public spectacle, the garden was an intimate twilight hunt. The walker in Eden was not flashing like lightning. He was taking deliberate, heavy steps in the violent wind. We know exactly who the walker was, and we know exactly how he moved. But the canonical text of Genesis leaves us with a massive historical gap regarding when this happened. In the cool of the day is an atmospheric condition, not a calendar date. How long were Adam and Eve actually in the garden before the walker arrived? To find the exact timeline of the fall, we have to leave the traditional canon and open a scroll preserved whole by the Ethiopian church. Because according to the ancient priests, the clock on the walker's arrival was incredibly precise. Just how many years did humanity have before the wind began to tear through the trees? The high plateaus of Ethiopia, where the air is thin and the ancient monasteries are carved directly into the volcanic rock. Inside these stone walls, an entire calendar of the ancient world was kept alive while the West forgot it existed. We have the walker, we have the crushing wind. But the canonical text of Genesis leaves the clock completely blank. In the cool of the day is a time of day, not a date in history. If you read only the King James, you might assume the bite of the fruit happened on day 8. Or perhaps Adam and Eve lived in Eden for a century. The English text collapses time, rushing us from the creation of the woman straight to the venom of the serpent. But there is an ancient ledger that refuses to leave the timeline vague. The Book of Jubilees, preserved whole inside the Ethiopian Orthodox canon and revered by the scribes in the Qumran caves, Jubilees is often called the Little Genesis. It tracks the exact years, months, and days of the Earth's earliest history. I offer this timeline not as canonical doctrine, but as the exact historical memory kept alive by the ancient priests. According to Jubilees chapter 3, the humans did not fall immediately. The text states they tended the garden in unbroken peace for exactly 7 years. Read that again. 7 years. 7 years of the Memra. The word, communing with them without the violent wind, without the terror of the localized, earth-shaking footprint. They knew the garden. They knew the rhythm of the days. But then the calendar shifts. Jubilees records the exact date the serpent spoke. The 17th day of the 2nd month, in the 8th year. Picture it. It is the afternoon of the 17th day. The bite is taken. The fruit is swallowed. The text of Jubilees says their eyes were opened, and they realized they were stripped of their glory. They sew fig leaves together to cover the ruin, but they do not hide immediately. They wait. Because according to this ancient Jewish timeline, the walker did not arrive the second they broke the command. There was an agonizing gap of time. Sit with that. We assume God caught them in the act. The timeline suggests he did not. They sat in their shame, listening to the birds, feeling the sun move across the sky, waiting for the inevitable atmospheric shift. They knew when the word usually came. Genesis 3-8 says the voice was walking in the cool of the day, the twilight. The sun begins to dip, the heat breaks, and then the canopy thrashes. The ruach tears through the branches, the coal strikes the earth, narrowing the infinite creator down to a single set of approaching footsteps. They have had hours to panic, and in that panic, they make a highly specific, tactical decision about where to take cover. Look at the final phrase of Genesis 3:8. Adam and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord God amongst the trees of the garden. Stop right there. Amongst the trees. In Hebrew, the word is etz. It translates as tree, wood, or timber. They are burying themselves inside the dense, physical wood of the garden. They are pressing their backs against the bark, hoping the physical mass of the forest will shield them from the heavy footsteps of the walker. Two ancient forces, one broken law, one approaching voice. But if the walker is the Memra, the localized word, who spoke the universe into existence, this hiding spot contains a dark, terrifying irony. What happens when a human tries to use the created wood to hide from the word that spoke it into the dirt? The rough bark of the ancient wood presses deep into Adam's spine as the wind violently whips the leaves above his head. He is pulling his knees to his chest, trying to make his physical geometry as small as possible in the dirt. He is not running. He is attempting to become completely invisible inside the timber of Eden. Picture it. Genesis 3:8 tells us exactly where the humans went when the atmospheric pressure of the garden shattered. The King James says they hid themselves from the presence of the Lord God amongst the trees of the garden. Stop right there. Look at the physical material they chose for a shield. In the original Hebrew, the word translated as trees is etz. It is a heavy, structural noun. It translates as a living tree, but it also translates as wood, timber, or a wooden stick. Adam and Eve are taking cover inside the dense, wooden architecture of the forest. They believe the sheer mass of the ETs will block the visual line of sight and muffle the deafening approach of the footsteps. But if we read this scene through the lens of the ancient Jewish Targums, a devastating, dark irony emerges from the wood. Recall the Aramaic paraphrase. The walker in the crushing wind is the Memra, the localized, physical word of the Lord. But the Memra is not merely an investigator arriving at the scene of a crime. According to both ancient Jewish theology and the Gospel of John, the Word is the architect of the terrain. John 1-3 says of the Word, "All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made." Read that again. The voice walking in the garden is the exact same voice that spoke the garden into the dirt. The Word designed the cellular structure of the bark pressing into Adam's back. The Word commanded the roots of the ETs to pull water from the soil. The created beings are attempting to use the created wood to hide from the Creator who engineered its very existence. Hold that image. It is the ultimate paradox of the fall. Humanity is trying to weaponize the physical world against the word that sustains it. But a forest cannot shield you from a storm that breaks the cedars of Lebanon. The etz cannot stop the cool. Same word, same weight. The violent rushing of the ruach does not pass by their hiding place. The footsteps do not wander off into another sector of Eden. The heavy, rhythmic pacing stops. The wind suddenly drops. The localized presence of the Lord halts directly outside the dense thicket of wood where the humans are holding their breath. The infinite has narrowed down to a single point, just inches from the timber. And then, the sound with a shadow finally speaks. Genesis 3, 9 inches. The King James records the very first question asked by God in the biblical text. And the Lord God called unto Adam, and said unto him, Where art thou? Sit with that. Two terrified humans, one shattered law, one localized word standing directly outside the trees. But an omnipresent God does not lose his creations in a garden, and the Memra does not need a map. Why does the word ask a question when he already knows the exact coordinates of the answer? Go back now to the twilight where this script began. The shadows stretching long across the garden. A man and a woman holding their breath behind the bark of the trees, listening to the heavy, rhythmic crushing of the soil. You have read that scene 100 times. But you are not looking at the same scene anymore. You are not watching an invisible spirit take a metaphorical evening stroll. You are watching the coal, the earth-shaking, cedar-breaking voice of the Lord, narrowing down into a localized, physical geometry. You are watching the ruach tear violently through the canopy, and you are watching the ancient Aramaic Memra step directly up to the wood. Genesis 3:9 inches, the King James reads, "And the Lord God called unto Adam, and said unto him, Where art thou?" Stop right there. The word does not ask the question because he has lost his coordinates in the brush. He asks it because the Memra always demands a response. The localized presence of God does not just hunt, it invites. The voice with mass is calling out to the fragile, hiding voices in the dirt, forcing Adam to step out. From behind the ETs, the wood he vainly tried to use as a shield, and face the Creator who engineered its very cellular structure. Picture it. Adam steps out into the wind. The sensory paradox is resolved. The sound has a shadow. The word has feet. This changes everything about how we read the coming exile. When Adam and Eve are driven out of Eden just verses later, they are not just losing a geographical paradise. They are losing direct, unshielded access to the walking voice. The text tells us a flaming sword is placed at the east of the garden. The separation is physical. The localized communion is broken. But the mystery of the cool does not end at the sealed gate of Eden. It simply waits. It waits for the smoke of Mount Sinai, where the voices would flash like fire before a terrified nation. It waits for the Targums to give it a name in the stone synagogues of the Galilee. And ultimately, it waits for a Jewish fisherman named John to write the opening line of his gospel, revealing that the exact same Memra that crushed the leaves in the cool of the day would put on flesh and walk the dusty roads of Judea. Same word, same weight. I hold this as one reading, one careful bridge between the ancient Jewish synagogue and the canonical text of Genesis. I am not handing you new doctrine. I am handing you the vocabulary of the ancients and letting you sit with the sheer gravity of what they believed happened in the trees. We have resolved the paradox of the footsteps. We know exactly who stepped out of the wind. But the biblical text leaves the rest of the timeline deliberately fractured. The humans are exiled into the dust. The garden is locked away. And the exact agonizing mechanism of how the Memra will eventually cross the boundary line of a fallen world without destroying it is a mystery the ancient scrolls are still holding. If you made it to the end of this journey, do me a favor. Comment the word "watched" down below so I know who is sitting with the text all the way through. Make sure you are subscribed so we can keep recovering these ancient threads together. And if you know one person who loves the book of Genesis but has never heard of the Memra, send this directly to them tonight. The garden is closed, but the voice is still walking.